In a matter of minutes, an entire family was dead, murdered by one of their own. The many trials of the killer all questioned whether he was a cold-blooded murderer or not guilty by reason of insanity. The road this house was on would be deemed Massacre Avenue, and horrifically enough, on the opposite side of the same street, another brutal murder would occur 20 years later. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is one that happened on Easter Sunday, and today should be Easter Sunday that I'm uploading, so happy Easter if you do celebrate. This is a case where a family just wanted to have a simple celebration, and it ended absolutely horrifically and devastated the entire community. So let's go ahead and get into the story. So it was 1975 in Ohio, and the Rupert family lived in Hamilton. It was March 30th, Easter Sunday, and the family went to an early church service and then gathered at the grandmother's home. Her name was Charity. Her home was at 635 Minor Avenue, where her son James, who was an adult, lived with her. Now, James' brother, so Charity's other son, Leonard Jr. brought his wife Alma and their 8 children over to see their grandma. All the young kids absolutely loved to hang out together and also with their grandma and their uncle. That afternoon, the kids were actually outside doing an Easter egg hunt while Charity, Leonard Jr., and Alma were all inside preparing lunch, and James was actually upstairs sleeping. Around 4:05 p.m., 11 people were dead. Everyone in the house besides James, the man sleeping upstairs. Around 6, James would call the police and tell them that there had been a shooting. Now, 4-year-old John, 9-year-old Teresa, 11-year-old David, 12-year-old Anne, 13-year-old Carol, 14-year-old Thomas, 16-year-old Michael, and 17-year-old Leonard III were all deceased. This was as well as their parents, Alma and Leonard Jr., as well as their grandma, Charity. The only sign of a struggle was a trash can that had been spilt over, but when investigators arrived, they claimed that it was a slaughterhouse. There was blood dripping from everywhere, and when the police did arrive, James was waiting right inside the door. 41-year-old James Rupert would be arrested and charged with the murders, and he refused to talk to anyone about what had happened. He was being very uncooperative, and after the medical examinations of all of the bodies of the victims, it was found that each victim was believed to be shot several times. The coroner believed that the killer had shot the victims multiple times to make sure that they were dead, and that he went after the children to make sure that they were not able to get away and tell somebody, and it appeared as though everyone had mostly been shot in the head, besides the grandmother, Charity, who was shot in the chest. It was believed that James had killed everyone and that his mother, Charity, had tried to lunge at him to prevent him from killing or killing more, and that is why she was shot point blank in the chest. But the youngest of the murders, the 4-year-old little boy, was the hardest for everyone, and he was the first one that most of the investigators at the scene were coming to first. And he was kind of slumped over on the couch, and it just broke everyone's heart.
I'll never forget it. It was the most horrible sight that I'd ever seen. On the living room floor, right at the foot of the couch, and he had a tinfoil covered Easter egg near his right hand, and he'd been shot in the side of the head.
After assessing the crime scene, investigators believed that James had woken up from his nap, his sleep, at 4 p.m., and then he proceeded to load his guns, which was a .357 Magnum and 2 of his .22 caliber guns, as well as a rifle, before heading downstairs. They believed he already knew what he was going to do. He had a plan, and then he went straight to the kitchen to kill his mother and also his brother and his sister-in-law. Also in the kitchen there were kids at that time, and so he ended up killing his nephew David and his nieces Teresa and Carol. It was then believed that James rushed to the living room where the rest of the kids were playing and ended up killing Anne, Leonard III, Michael, Thomas, and John. He had started killing at approximately 4 p.m. and the killing was over by 4:05 p.m. It had taken 5 minutes to massacre an entire family, and a family that was related to the killer himself. He was believed to wait hours before he called the police, and he was now being charged with 11 counts of aggravated homicide. Prosecutors were fearing that he would plead insanity, and one of the main fears for that was the fact that his family actually had money and that he would inherit around $300,000 if he was released due to being found criminally insane, and would be able to live out the rest of his life with his family's money after he had murdered them.
He murdered his family to collect his brother's $300,000 or so in life insurance. That's what I think. That's what I think the evidence showed, and that's what I believe.
The prosecutor believed that he would pretend to be insane and then suddenly be cured in order to take that money and start his life over. This case made the front of the New York Times the next day, and the Hamilton Police Department were flooded with calls from people wanting to know what had happened, and also reporters all over the world trying to get information. Now, there was an intern who worked at the police department at this time named Dennis Hardy, and he said the police department was a madhouse during this time, and that he had actually seen James being brought into the station, and James spoke to him and was smiley and perky and unconcerned. He told him good morning, but Dennis also said that James wasn't seeming to be cocky or smirking like he had gotten away with something or that he had done something bad, that it just appeared as though he was happy and it was just another good day for him. It was unknown, obviously, if this was the beginning of him trying to pretend that he was insane or if this just was how he acted. Now, while looking into James Rupert, police had found that about a month before the murders, James had actually been buying ammunition for his guns when he had asked the clerk for silencers for those guns. Now, it was believed that he didn't receive any at this time, though he did ask. And the day prior to Easter Sunday was actually James' 41st birthday, and he had been seen shooting tin cans with his guns along the river in town. It wasn't too unusual to see him doing this and see him in town. That's just kind of what they did around there. However, the night before the murders, James actually went to a bar, and this was called the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge. And it was found that he had spoken to one of the waitresses, and her name was Wanda Bishop, and she was telling investigators that James was very frustrated with his mother, that he felt his mother was trying to evict him and kept threatening him for that because he wasn't paying rent. His mother believed that if he could buy beers every single night, that he should be able to pay at least some in rent. He told Wanda that he wanted to solve this problem, and then around 11 p.m. he left the bar, and Wanda believed that is exactly what he was going to do, but then he came back and he told Wanda he hadn't solved the problem yet. He stayed at the bar until it closed around 2:30 that morning, and then he left again. That is the last time Wanda would see him until, of course, the news articles came out saying what he had done. But James went out drinking pretty much every single night. During the days, he would sleep away his hangovers, and then only to go out the very next night and do it all over again. And neighbors did consider him nice and considerate and normal, and they didn't think that he was capable of this. They described him as non-assuming, quiet, small, and even wimpy. He also was found not to have any sort of criminal record besides this strange incident that happened 10 years prior to this, where he had made an obscene phone call in a public library. He kind of had an outburst, and he said that his mother and his brother were trying to report to the FBI that he was a communist and also a homosexual. Now, James had been born on March 29th of 1934 to Charity and Leonard I, and his brother Leonard Jr. was actually 2 years older than him. Their father was said to be very violent, but he died when James was around 12 years old, and so the boys really became the men of the household, and he believed that his mother was disappointed in him because he was not a girl like she had hoped. Now, James would say that Leonard Jr., so his brother, picked on him all the time when they were growing up, and that by the time he was 16, he tried to take his own life. But he did survive, but he wasn't doing well in school, and then he flunked out of college after 2 years, and as an adult, he had trouble trying to find jobs. He was this small guy at 5 feet 6 inches, and he was said to be made fun of for most of his life. James did have some girlfriends, but not many, and one of those girlfriends was found to have married his brother. So Alma had dated James before she had dated and married Leonard Jr. But during the time of the murders, James was said to be very low on money. He did not have a job. In fact, he had lost all of his money in the stock market, even after borrowing some from his brother. He was forced to live with his mother due to this at 41 years old, and he was said not to be working towards a solution at all, to pay back his brother, to pay rent, to get a job. He was just drinking all the time. Now, like the employee Wanda had mentioned, his mother Charity was very open with the fact that she did want him to do more with his life and to pay rent and to leave the house eventually. The problem wasn't that he was necessarily living in this house where she had room for him. It was that he was taking advantage of the situation and Charity's accommodations and just kind of acting like a child. All of that history and the almost victim mentality that James seemed to have all throughout his life, and possibly be at some points in his life, was thought to be his culmination of motives that had stacked up in his mind and had maybe led to this. Now, his criminal trial was among the messiest I've ever seen. You see, he had a trial in June of that year, so 3 months after the massacre. Now, this was in front of a 3-judge panel that was in the hometown of Hamilton where all of this had happened. So James pled not guilty by reason of insanity, but did admit his guilt in the murders. And the prosecution claimed that they were certain that he just wanted the family money, and he got them out of the way. The prosecution claimed that they actually went to the crime scene. They were prepping for the trial, and they looked at every single piece of evidence in that house that they possibly could. And prosecutor Michael Gosmer said that it was horrifying, that they seriously still could not get the images of that house out of their head, because they claimed that in the living room where their children were killed, there was actually fingernails in the walls where they had tried to climb away from being killed. One of the children also almost got away, got to the back door and left, but was killed before they could. The prosecutor said that upstairs he found a book where James would be staying, and this was called How to Commit a Perfect Murder. They also then claimed that they had paperwork that confirmed their theory that James had taken so much of his brother's money, and then his brother was refusing to give him any more, obviously, because he had lost it all, and that this really angered James and angered him enough to kill. Now, James ended up not having to face a jury. He chose the 3-judge panel, and so on July 3rd, James Rupert was found guilty of the 11 counts of murder and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences. Though this wouldn't be the end, because, like I told you, this happened in their hometown. It was believed that due to this, he received an unfair trial. And on top of that, the 3-judge panel allegedly didn't know if the final ruling had to be unanimous or not, and had actually told James that they didn't know and that it didn't have to be unanimous. And so everything was just messed up on that end. And so James was given a complete retrial, because the judges were not unanimous at all. 2 had found him sane, while 1 found him insane. But 20 days later, over in Findlay, Ohio, the second trial began, and this time prosecutors would bring forward witnesses whom they had questioned prior. Now, these witnesses included, the person who had seen James ask about the silencers for his guns, the person who saw him using guns the day before, and the bar employee the night before, with their statements to the court. James was once again found guilty and sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences, but this still wasn't the end. Now, exactly 3 years after the murders, Alma's father would wake up on Easter Day, Easter morning, and he would take his own life. This was thought to be because of the grief of losing his child, his daughter, his son-in-law, and his 8 grandchildren. 2 years after that, James appealed his sentence and was given a new trial. So it was 1980 and he was headed to court, and his defense was going to do their best to prove that he was insane. But then suddenly James was saying this was double jeopardy, that this couldn't happen, and so he was fighting this for the next 2 years. But then in 1982, he said, no, it's not double jeopardy. we can move forward. Now, this trial is when psychiatrists were brought in to testify, and 2 of them had spoken to James, and both concluded that he was unable to control his actions due to his paranoia and delusions. One claimed that if there were more people in that home, they might have been killed by him too, and that his ego was overwhelmed by his rage. They also said that he was obsessed with the belief that his family, the police, the FBI, were in a long-standing conspiracy to persecute him. One psychiatrist would testify that James had told her about that day that he was asleep most of Easter and then wanted to go to the shooting range when he woke up, so he got his guns, but that the original plan wasn't to kill everybody. He said that as he left, his brother asked him about his car, which was a Volkswagen, and James was insulted by this, believing that he was trying to make fun of his car and make fun of the fact that he didn't have much money because his brother was a successful man. And so that is when James said he began to shoot everybody. And when he was done, he laid on the couch for the next 2 hours contemplating suicide. But then he decided that that was a sin, and so he called the police instead. Now, some of these testimonies were swaying more on the side of not guilty by reason of insanity, but was that an act? Could these psychologists see through a possible act? And also his statements about his brother bullying him and that is why he ended up killing everybody, that could point to being more of the motive, but does that prove that he was sane in that moment? It's a very strange case, and the trial would last for 2 weeks and be decided by a jury. One of the jurors even ended up collapsing in the middle of the trial. They had a heart attack and died that day, and it was believed that it was because of the photos they were having to look at. Interestingly enough, James would be found guilty of first-degree murder of only 2 people, his mother and his brother. But then he was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the other 9. For this, he was sentenced to 2 life sentences, and his lawyer tried to appeal, citing a judicial error, but this was denied. James was sent to the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution, and the prosecution believed that the reason that he ended up being found guilty of those 2 murders was because the jury feared that he would just be released, that he was pretending to be insane, and that he would get all the money and get to go free to possibly do it again.
Had he been found not guilty by reason of insanity, he would have inherited the money. It's not my job to analyze him. It's not my job to feel sorry for him. It's not my job to figure out why. I leave that to others. My job is to get him locked up, and that's just exactly what I did.
But this sentence did not please the remaining family members of the victims, and in fact, Alma's mother said, "I sometimes think I'd like to string him up on the cross like Christ and cut a little piece off at a time. I want him to bleed slowly. But if you put that in the paper, people will wonder what kind of a Catholic I am." She believed that James was also to blame for her husband's death after he took his own life due to the grief and due to the juror after having to look at what had occurred and what he had done, meaning that she believed that he had actually killed 13 people. But what happened to the home turned crime scene that was said to be covered in blood? Well, a year after the murder, it was actually cleaned, recarpeted due to the bloodstains not being able to be removed, and then it was sold at auction. A family actually bought it because they had just moved to the area, they had no idea what occurred, and they rented it. They were there for a little bit, but they allegedly left the home due to paranormal activity. They were hearing things, strange voices, lights would turn on and off, and doors would slam. Many families have been said to live there throughout the years, and most of them haven't stayed for long due to allegedly things like this happening. But in 2015, a family moved in and they haven't had any issues. In fact, they went on the news to talk about it, and the mother said that you can still see the blood stains in the basement, but it doesn't really scare her. It's just proof that it happened.
Nearly 40 years later, 29-year-old Cinnamon Baker was well aware of the house's dark past when she and her 2 young kids moved in, showing WCPO decades-old bloodstains in the basement.
The neighborhood just says it's just a house.
On this block, there's a lot of traffic for Lindenwald.
It's a spectacle. It's a sightseeing type thing. You know what I mean? So a lot of times around Halloween, people will just start driving by, start thinking of haunted Ohio. You'll see people, like, they'll park down the street and walk up and down both sides of the street.
They call Minor Avenue Massacre Avenue.
Sometimes inconvenient when you're walking out to go get lunch with your son and someone just walks right up, you know, and they want to have a talk about the house or something like that. But, you know, It doesn't happen all that often.
I've had people come up to my house thinking it was the Rupert house. I live on the other side of the street. And well, my thing was I played along with them.
A lot of people think I'm crazy for living here, but it's not creepy. It's my house. It's my home.
Cinnamon and her neighbors ask, if you're gonna come gawk, slow down on the street because their kids are outside playing.
She said it doesn't make her feel any less safe, but if James were to be paroled, she would feel a little uncomfortable. Now, the Rupert home was allegedly found to be the home right across the street from a home that would also become a crime scene 21 years later. Tina Mott was murdered in her Hamilton home, her Hamilton apartment, and this just happened a few steps away from the home where the 11 members of the family were killed. It was June of 1996, and Tina Mott would go missing. She was a mother to an 18-month-old baby, and she lived with her boyfriend, Tim Bradford. Tina was supposed to visit family during this time. However, she never made it. Her boyfriend was claiming she had already left. She had, left the baby with him, and he didn't know where she could have gone. It was actually Tim's mother who decided to call and report her missing after she could not get any information about where she was. For the next 2 months, she had completely vanished until August 7th, when a human skull was found in the lake by boys who were just fishing. It was missing all the teeth, and it had a deep indentation as well as knife marks all over the head. It appeared as though someone had tried to remove all of the flesh as well as the jaw and the eyes. After looking at missing persons reports in the area, they got about 4 matches, and one of those was Tina Mott. Now, Tim's mother, the one who reported her missing, would say that Tina was actually scared of her son due to the violence that he would inflict upon her sometimes, and due to the fact that he practiced Satanism. So at this point, Tim's storage shed was searched, and they found 19 knives with blood on them, as well as a book on how to kill with your bare hands. When police made it to their home, it was actually a duplex that they shared with another family, but inside of their portion, they used luminol and found that blood had been cleaned. Though they still could not say that this skull belonged to Tina due to everything being removed, until bone samples were actually taken from inside of the skull and found to be a match. Tim would then confess in a plea deal for manslaughter, and he said that he was high on acid that night of her murder. They were playing board games, they started to argue with one another, and then he ended up hitting her where she got a nosebleed and she went into the bathroom to clean herself up. And at that time, Tim said he was cleaning up the apartment, including some of his fishing equipment, and that before he knew it, she was running out of the bathroom at him, and he was holding this fishing knife, which he accidentally cut her throat with. Now, he would tell police where the rest of her remains were, and half of her body was located. It was believed that the rest had been eaten by animals. Every bone found had knife wounds on it, and Tim admitted that he had flushed her organs down the toilet, dismembered her body, and disposed of her bones. Tim said he loved Tina and was sorry, but he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 25 years. He will be eligible for parole this year in 2023. Many online, including Tina's friends, are actually trying to spread awareness to hopefully keep him behind bars. Her friends have created a petition on Care2 Petitions, which I will leave down below. Her friends have also posted some of Tina's poetry. They said that she loved to write, and that in one particular poem, she might have seen her own demise, and expressed those feelings in one of her poems. The poem said, "Slowly losing all sense of reality, motionless, just struggling for a breath, barely recovering from the heartless brutality, looking into the eyes of death. All vital signs are quickly fading. Every minute comes closer to losing a heartbeat. This is an endless hope during all the waiting, wondering if there is someone on the other side to meet. Without any control, a force pulls deeply within. There is a bright light guiding my way." They have also disclosed that the detective in this case, who solved the case, visits her gravesite often and places flowers there for her. But how odd and disturbing that just across the street 2 separate and brutal murders would occur 2 decades apart. Now, James Rupert had been in prison that whole time, and he was denied parole several times, including in 1995, 2005, and 2015. The last denial was actually determined by James's unwillingness to complete recommended programming, and he had negative institutional conduct. His next hearing was scheduled for February of 2025. However, on June 4th of 2022, James Rupert, known as inmate A169321, died at the prison medical facility at 88 years old. This was said to be due to natural causes. Do you believe that James was not guilty by reason of insanity? Should he have spent time in jail? Was he after the family money? Was he pretending to be insane? What made him snap that day? Was it paranoia and delusions? Or was it revenge on his brother? Or jealousy of his brother and his wife and kids? I find it very terrifying that in a matter of 5 minutes he could kill 11 people due to the fact that he had his guns, and several of them at that. This happened so long ago, and yet even now we are dealing with this so often, and children at schools are fearing for their lives. And that should not be something that a child going to school for an education should ever have to fear. But it's not something that someone going out to a concert or just a big event should have to fear either. Not someone going to a family get-together should have to fear. And I follow an Instagram called Every Town that talks about gun violence in America. And I will link their Instagram down below if you would like to follow it. It gives so much great information and ways to help. I hope you have a wonderful Easter, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.